and this is when we had the advent of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which have made a comeback over the past couple of a decade or two. But the give me your sense of just having with that metaphor out there of pouring the gasoline on these different fires. What was the impetus for Wilson to get into the war, and how much was what was happening domestically? How much of what was happening domestically was sort of like, what's the relationship between that? I mean, because we should remind people too, this is also the time where we had no income tax until around, I guess, 1917. And how much, talk about the dynamics there, because, why he wanted to enter this war. You made the point in the book that I think our army at that time our military was the size of was it Portugal's?
That's right.
And so we weren't a military power, but there was some semblance of like, this is our way, this is our ticket to become one.
I think you've hit something there with the idea of the ticket. Wilson was a very ambitious man, paradoxical man, and I think he, from the beginning, felt that the United States, in some way or other, had to make use of this enormous crisis. This was the largest war the world had ever seen, that began in 1914. It would unfortunately be surpassed several decades later, but at that point, history had never seen something so murderous. And he felt like the United States had a sacred mission. At first, he thought to stop the war and somehow impose a peace. Then he came to feel, when he saw that the war was completely deadlocked, late 1916, early 1917, that it was time for the United States to enter the war, because we couldn't put our stamp on the world unless we had helped end this war. From the beginning, it really was a myth that the US was neutral, because we were selling huge amounts of arms and munitions and industrial supplies to the Allies, principally Britain and France, but also Russia and Italy, who were on the Allied side. Huge amounts. Bullets, machine guns, parts that would be assembled into submarines and destroyers, artillery pieces, all kinds of stuff. 40% of the British military budget was being spent in the United States. So the US was not really neutral. Theoretically, American business was equally free to sell to Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they couldn't do it because those countries were completely surrounded by a very tight naval blockade. By 2.5 years into the war, Wilson and his people realized this war was a stalemate. Unless the US joined in, neither side was going to win. And if the Allies didn't win, Americans who'd bought British and French and Russian war bonds would never get paid back. And of course, those who bought Imperial Russian war bonds never were paid back. Plus, Britain and France were running out of money with which to buy all those military supplies here. And unless the US officially joined them, it would be very hard to have government-to-government credits allowing them to buy those arms. So that's what brought the US into the war. But there was a lot of opposition to the war because there were many Americans who felt, some felt some ancestral loyalty to Germany if their ancestors had come from there or from Austria-Hungary. But there were also many Americans, largely but not entirely on the political left, who felt this was a conflict that was tearing the world apart and there was no good reason for the United States to join it. And so there was a lot of opposition to the war. And I think that's what led to these extremely repressive measures, which we've largely forgotten about, that the Wilson administration imposed here.
So you can go on, Sam.
Oh, well, I was going to say, let's go into those, because in 1917, as soon as we essentially enter into this war, Wilson and Congress passes. First, it was the Espionage Act, and then it was the Sedition Act within like less than a year. I mean, we just saw actually somebody got convicted for sedition in the attack on the Capitol. The leader of the Oath Keepers. We have seen the Espionage Act used against reporters over the past, like really starting in the Obama administration, as a mechanism of prosecution. Give us a sense of like how those were rolled out. Like, was that a fight at all, or was it just like, we're going to do this? I mean, there was so much paranoia in this country, and you think about how much more difficult it was to sort of like attack America at that time. But there was a lot of paranoia.
There was a lot of paranoia, and there was a lot of opposition to going to war. Wilson went before Congress, April 2nd, 1917, and asked it to declare full-scale war on Germany and its ally, Austria-Hungary. And there were 6 United States senators who voted against going to war, and 50 members of the House of Representatives. So both Republicans and Democrats. So there was considerable opposition to the war. Some weeks later, Wilson pushed the Espionage Act through Congress. The Sedition Act, which came the following year, was basically a set of amendments strengthening the Espionage Act. And that act, which is still in effect, although it's been considerably amended since then, and ironically may be the law that Donald Trump gets in trouble under for those classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. The Espionage Act enabled several things. One was press censorship on a huge scale. It gave to the Postmaster General the power to control what publications could travel through the US mail. And that was crucial because it didn't affect mainstream daily newspapers, almost all of which supported the war, which could be sold on street corners or delivered to people's homes. But weeklies, monthlies, journals of opinion, almost the entire socialist press, almost the entire foreign language press had to depend on the US mail to reach their subscribers before the internet, before radio, before TV. The Postmaster General used that power with great zest. He loved being chief censor. He was a terrible guy. Albert Burleson, a very conservative former congressman from Texas, son and grandson of Confederate veterans. His family owned 20 slaves at the time that he was born. He, in effect, shut down 75 newspapers and magazines by refusing to allow them through the U.S. mail. He shut down the best magazine in the country, a literary monthly in New York called The Masses, which published John Reed, Walter Lippmann, Edna St. Vincent Millay, all sorts of great writers. It infuriated him because of some of its contents, one of the things he reportedly objected to was a cartoon that showed the Liberty Bell crumbling. Ironically, this whole press censorship operation, shutting down dissident opinion, something Donald Trump would have loved to do but wasn't able to do, was carried out from post office headquarters, the building that 100 years later became the Trump International Hotel. Another thing enabled under the Espionage Act was putting people in jail for speaking out against the war. During those 4 years, 1917 to 21, there were roughly 1,000 Americans sent to prison for a year or more, and a far larger number for shorter periods of time, solely for things that they wrote or said.
Including Eugene Debs. But I want to get to Debs in a minute. But was there any type of like pushback in terms of the courts? I mean, this is a very conservative court in 1917. This is the same court that is basically allowed for Jim Crow laws and for disenfranchisement of in particular of African-American voters. Was there any attempt to push back on this, on a constitutional basis, or was it just everybody was all in?
Well, we think we've got a conservative Supreme Court now, but the one in 1917 was really conservative. There was
just in defense of this court, give them time. It's only been a couple of years.
Yeah, well, we
Not
know,
even.
meet again behind bars somewhere. But in 1919, remember, this is after the war ended, Espionage Act still in effect. A test case came before the court, the Schenck case, based on the distribution of some leaflets in Philadelphia by activists who were opposing the draft. And their lawyers hoped that the court would find the Espionage Act unconstitutional. To their horror, the court unanimously found the Espionage Act constitutional, and that opinion was written by the justice in whom the lawyers had placed the most hope, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. But then something interesting happened. Holmes was large enough to change his mind. Later that same year, another case testing the constitutionality of the Espionage Act came before the court, late 1917, the Abrams case, again involving distribution of leaflets, which were actually tossed out the window of a factory in New York City, fell on the street below, protesting the administration sending troops to support the anti-Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. By this point, Holmes had changed his mind. He told his fellow justices, I'm going to dissent and feel that the Espionage Act is not constitutional. They were horrified. And in an unprecedented action, 3 justices came to see Holmes in his house to try to talk him out of this. They talked to him in his study. They said, we should all stay behind our country in this hour of need. You were a soldier in the Civil War, which he was. He was a Union officer who was wounded. His sword was hanging on the wall above them. And we know what they said because Holmes's law clerk was listening in through a half-open door from the next room. But Holmes said, no, I'm going to dissent here. And Justice Louis Brandeis joined him in that dissent. And Supreme Court dissents don't make law, but their dissent in this case, talking about the importance of a free marketplace in ideas, has been, according to one of Holmes' biographers, the most frequently quoted Supreme Court dissent in American history.
What was it what inspired that change?
A lot of people worked on Holmes over the summer between these 2 cases coming to the court. We know who a few of them were. One of them was Felix Frankfurter, who would later become a justice of the Supreme Court himself. And I think he came to see that, once you go down the path of restricting what people can say, it's very different from restricting what people can do. There's nobody had any doubt that acts of political violence should be punished. But once you go down the route of restricting what people can say, it's a dangerous path to go down.